Hey guys, I wanted to do a terrain analysis of Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones is actually coming from a totally different terrain of consciousness to most books and shows and movies that you've seen, which is actually why it's so gripping and shocking and entertaining and fun. Game of Thrones is actually coming from Pyramid, the will-based terrain of consciousness. That is a completely different terrain to most books and movies, particularly ones in the fantasy genre. So most books, movies, TV shows in the fantasy genre are coming from Square, the order-based terrain. The story of Game of Thrones is at Pyramid. The prevailing terrain of the characters in that world is at Pyramid, and the worldview of the author is at Pyramid. That makes Game of Thrones really different to read. And also, it's the same in the TV show, especially in the first 5 series of the TV show, which are closely based on George R.R. Martin's books. The title of the show, Game of Thrones, gives this away.
When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground.
At Pyramid, it's about self-interest and scrambling for power and how can I accumulate enough power or align myself with people in power to stay safe. The vast majority of characters in Game of Thrones are at Pyramid, and so they're not sitting there wrestling with moral dilemmas. They're just scrambling around to see, who do I have to manipulate, who do I have to cheat, who do I have to swear my allegiance to, who do I have to bend the knee to in order to survive and gain more power and build up my house. If this was a Square story, we would be exploring themes like honor, duty, how to be a good, civilized member of society. We'd be exploring themes of good versus evil. How can I work to save the common good of everybody? Those are the kinds of themes that we see in Square literature. We are not exploring these themes in Game of Thrones.
Honor? I've got 7 kingdoms to rule. 1 king, 7 kingdoms. Do you think honor keeps them in line? Do you think it's honor that's keeping the peace? It's fear. Fear and blood.
So one of the best ways to really see how Game of Thrones is coming from Pyramid is to compare it to a classic Square fantasy story like Lord of the Rings. So imagine Gandalf sweeps in and says, "There is an evil rising in the east." And Boromir says, "Look, Gondor can't get involved because they're in the middle of like a clan war with the Rangers from the south." And Elrond's too busy laying siege to the Wood Elves to consolidate his power base. And Gimli's at war with Balin over who controls the mines of Moria. And Frodo's too busy torturing Merry and flaying his skin so that he can get the rightful name of Baggins. I mean, it just wouldn't happen in a Square story. If Gandalf comes sweeping in saying there is an evil rising in the east, everybody rallies together. And often it will be a central character who's quite humble, who's very loyal, who's very honourable. Think about Frodo, Aragorn, and people will rally to them and they'll set aside their previous enmities and their clan squabbles and their historical battles and they work together to overthrow the great evil coming from the east.
I will take the ring to Mordor.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
Now compare that to Game of Thrones. In Game of Thrones, there's actually a big evil. Right at the very opening scene of the book, we meet the White Walkers. You know, that's the equivalent of Sauron. That's the equivalent of the Death Star. But in this universe that we're in, which is at Pyramid, instead of everybody banding together and rallying together to overthrow this, we hardly hear anything about it for about the first 4 books. Because they're too busy scrambling for power between the Targaryens and the Baratheons and the Lannisters and the Starks.
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
What we're seeing is clan versus clan, house versus house, all scrambling for power, making allegiances, breaking allegiances, reforming allegiances, because their imperative is always to accumulate power. What do I need to do in this moment to get more power? Whereas at Square, a character at Square is much more loyal. They would stick with the one house for the rest of their life. They would fight to the death for that house. They would fight for their country. They would fight for their nation People at Square are very consistent. They don't abandon their friends just because the guy over there has more money or more power. They're committed to working for the highest good of the majority, and they'll set aside their personal interests. It's a very selfless terrain. I mean, imagine Princess Leia saying, sorry, don't have time to overthrow the Death Star and join the rebels because I'm currently trying to consolidate my power base in Alderaan. Pyramid is a terrain of self-interest. And so what we're exploring in Game of Thrones is completely different themes than a Square author would be exploring with the same story. Okay, so I'm going to read you a little bit about Pyramid from our book, The 10 Terrains of Consciousness, just to give you a feel for this terrain. So a person at Pyramid sees himself as the master of his own destiny. He's not ruled by any gods or by any governments. He's in control.
There is only one God, and his name is death.
And there is only one thing we say to death. Not today.
People at Pyramid see the world, nature, and life as being inherently dangerous. They do not believe in the essential goodness of man. Instead, they believe that people are inherently selfish, cruel, and heartless.
There's a beast in every man, and it stirs when you put a sword in his hand.
They see the world as a jungle where everyone is out for themselves and where people are untrustworthy and will turn on you in a heartbeat.
People work together when it suits them. They're loyal when it suits them. They love each other when it suits them, and they kill each other when it suits them.
So as a result of believing all of this, people at Pyramid think that the only way to protect themselves is to acquire as much power as possible in order to be able to dominate other people and exert their will over them.
Knowledge is power.
Seize him. Cut his throat. Stop. Wait. I've changed my mind. Let him go. Step back 3 paces. Turn around. Close your eyes. Power is power.
And so by power, we're talking about earthly power, the kind of power that allows you to dominate other people, to make them do what you want. And this kind of power, I'm just reading from this kind of power is measured by wealth, property, and territory, and by how much you can manipulate and control the behavior of others. So people at Pyramid work hard to acquire and hold on to this kind of power. And they will go to any lengths to achieve it, including manipulation, lies, scheming, trickery, fear-mongering, abuse, violence, and war, believing that the end of keeping themselves safe and on top justifies the means. Those who are not powerful in their own right understand that they need to align themselves with someone who is powerful in order to stay safe. So essentially, the survival strategy at Pyramid is to become the alpha male or queen bee, or to align yourself with the strongest alpha male or queen bee one can find. This is the way people at the will-based terrain control the world around them in order to manage their internal fear. Does that sound like anyone you know, Cersei Lannister? Sounds like everybody in Game of Thrones. Now, I'm not saying George R.R. Martin is personally at Pyramid. I've never met the man. I have no idea what his terrain of consciousness is. And he has not done our terrains quiz, which, by the way, if you're interested, you can do it at 10terrains.com. Find out your terrain. George R.R. Martin has not done that yet. So I don't personally know his terrain. I haven't met him. But in my experience, when you read someone's book, the world that they have created, the perspective of the characters, the prevailing terrain of the characters in that book is usually pretty indicative of the writer's terrain. If you read Jane Austen, you know you're reading a Square author. If you read Tolkien, you know you're reading a Square author. They're all talking about how to fit into society, how to work for the greater good, how to overcome evil, all those kinds of Square themes. What is happening on Game of Thrones is so fundamentally different to what we are used to seeing play out in the fantasy genre. Because I guarantee you 99% of stories you've ever read or seen are at Square. And the themes are bad guys at Pyramid and everyone at Square bands together to overthrow them and save the day for the common good of all. That's what we're used to. That's why it's such a collective trauma and shock when Ned Stark gets his head chopped off. Because if this was Tolkien writing Game of Thrones, Ned Stark would be positioned as the unlikely hero who ends up gathering everyone together, and he overthrows Cersei and he exposes the incest, and he steps up and helps Robert Baratheon reclaim his kingdom and start running his kingdom in an honourable way, and then they all band together and they turn their attention to the White Walkers and they save the realm. And that would all happen in the first book. Whereas in Game of Thrones, we don't even see any emphasis in the storyline on the big evil, the White Walkers, until series 5, which is book 5 of the novels. Because George R.R. Martin is just not concerned with that. Good over evil is not what he's exploring. He's exploring the ins and outs of power, the scrambling for power, the gaining of power, and the keeping of power. And it's why Ned Stark is hopeless at the Game of Thrones. He ends up with his head chopped off because he's at Square. He doesn't know how to play that game. All he knows is how to listen to his honour and his integrity and keep his loyalty to Robert and do what he feels is right. So the central question in the books is, who will win the Iron Throne? That's a pyramid question. Who's going to keep power? Who's going to get power? Who's going to outsmart everybody else? Who's going to manipulate and backstab everyone else to get on that throne? And we see the lengths they all go to. I mean, we're talking people sacrificing their own daughter. We're talking people inviting someone to a wedding and then slaughtering them. Oh, Robb Stark. Can you imagine Lord of the Rings? Bilbo Baggins has his 11th birthday party and he invites all the other hobbits, and he specially invites the Sackville Bagginses so that he can slaughter them at his birthday party because he wants power over that clan of hobbits? No. You can't imagine it because it wouldn't happen in a Square story, which is why it hasn't happened in anything else you've ever seen, which is why you were so horrified when it happened in Game of Thrones. One of the things I found really interesting and unusual when I was reading the books before I watched the TV series was like trying to figure out who is the hero in this book. Like, who should I be cheering for? Who should I be barracking for? Who should I be rooting for? In the first book, I was kind of rooting for Ned Stark, and then I'm kind of rooting for Arya, and then I'm rooting for Sansa, and then I'm like, who's the main character? And it's not because it's an ensemble storyline. There's plenty of ensemble storylines where you have people to cheer for. It's just because it's coming from Pyramid, so there is nobody being positioned as the honourable hero. And as soon as someone gets set up as a bit of an honourable guy, they get killed. So it really shocks the system watching the show for that reason. Alright guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video and it's explained why Game of Thrones is so different to anything else you've ever watched. As well, obviously, as the fact that the acting is brilliant, the writing is brilliant, the cinematography is brilliant, the makeup, the sets, the costumes, the epic landscapes, shooting those scenes beyond the wall in Iceland. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, spectacular production values. They've spent millions on it. I'm highly impressed. The screenwriting is genius, the way they've adapted the books to the TV shows. I'm in awe of their screenwriting skills. But there is also a little thread of what makes it interesting is that we are actually inside the mindset of Pyramid for 1 hour every week as we watch them all scramble for power. That's what makes it so naughty to watch. You may be at a totally different terrain than the ones I've covered in this video because there are actually 10 terrains of consciousness. So if you want to find out your terrain, just pop over to 10terrains.com and do our quiz. It only takes about 5 minutes to do and you'll have an idea of your terrain. It's pretty interesting stuff. Okay guys, see you in the next video.